Good evening and welcome to this webinar, which is looking at the US presidential and congressional elections to be held next Tuesday, American time, and the possible consequences of a Biden victory for US economic, trade, and foreign policy, especially in the Asia Pacific region. We do have some participants from Indonesia today, so selamat sore to you. And I think we've also got at least one participant from Europe, so good afternoon to you, I think it is at this time, and I hope you'll find today's proceedings informative. Let me begin by drawing on what opinion polls are telling us. There are two major aggregators of opinion polls, that is, sites which take the average of a large number of opinion polls so that the various biases and errors that are inevitably a part of any opinion poll to at least some extent are evened out. The Real Clear Politics one you can see on the left is an average of 9 leading opinion polls. The 538 on the right, that's the site created by Nate Silver, who came to prominence during the 2012 election with uncannily accurate predictions of the likely outcome, is a much more sophisticated weighted average of about 450 different opinion polls. But the message from both of them is clear that throughout this year, and especially since he became the Democrats' presumptive and then official nominee for the presidency, Joe Biden has had a consistent and fairly commanding lead over Donald Trump in the opinion polls. And that if anything, since the formal campaign began, as by tradition in the United States it does on the Labor Day weekend, the first weekend in September, that margin has, if anything, widened, and Biden's opinion poll ratings have consistently been over 50%, whereas Trump's have typically been in the low 40s. In other words, Biden's lead in the opinion poll has typically been at least 8 and sometimes as much as 10 percentage points. The betting market, I should say, of course, in order to win the election, Biden doesn't have to win a majority of the popular vote. Trump didn't win a majority of the popular vote last time, but he won in the Electoral College. That's the body established by the US Constitution, which actually determines who wins the presidential election. Each of the 50 states, plus the District of Columbia, have delegates to the Electoral College in the same proportion as their membership of the House of Representatives and the Senate. Every state has 2 senators and a minimum of 1 member of the House of Representatives. So small states like Wyoming, for example, will have 3 delegates to the Electoral College. As by convention, so too does the District of Columbia, even though it doesn't have any senators. That's where Washington, D.C. is located. The largest states like California, for example, have 53 members of the House of Representatives and 2 senators, so they have 55 Electoral College votes. This, by design, gives voters in smaller states a greater weight in the election campaign than voters in the most popular states of California, New York, Florida, and Texas. That tends to give an advantage to the Republicans, and it's an important part of why Donald Trump won the 2016 election, despite not getting a majority of the nationwide popular vote, in the same way that George Bush did in 2000. That was something that hadn't happened prior to then, since the election of 1876, which was a very controversial one in US political history, but I won't go into here. What this first chart shows is that in 5 of the 6 states which Donald Trump unexpectedly won in 2016, and which were crucial to his victory in the 2016 election. That is in the states of Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Florida, and North Carolina, the only exception being Ohio. But in all the other states, Biden has a fairly convincing lead. He's only behind in Ohio. And there are 4 other states which Trump won in 2016, in some cases easily, where it would seem that Joe Biden has a fighting chance of winning. That's Georgia, which hasn't voted for a Democratic candidate as president since Jimmy Carter won it in 1976, Iowa, Arizona, which hasn't voted for a Democrat as a presidential candidate since, I think, Lyndon Johnson in 1964, and Texas, which used to be a solidly Democratic state up until the 1970s or 80s, but where, at least until recently, Joe Biden was appearing remarkably competitive in the polls, although Donald Trump has increased his lead significantly in that state, the second largest in terms of Electoral College votes in the last couple of weeks. Now, of course, Joe Biden has 228 Electoral College votes in the bag as a result of his unassailable lead in California and New York, as well as other states on the west coast of the United States, Illinois, which is centered on Chicago, Virginia, which is the southern suburbs of Washington for the most part, and the northeast of the United States, that is New Jersey and the states of New England. And so Trump, by comparison, has a lock on about 129 Electoral College votes. That includes most of the mountain states, the southern states of the United States, and a few others that are usually solidly Republican. So the outcome is going to hinge on the remaining 129 Electoral College votes in these 10 states. And one of the differences between 2016 and 2020 is that these states, for the most part, with the exception of Ohio and Texas, seem to be more winnable by the Democrats than they turned out to be in 2016. For what it's worth, the betting markets are giving Joe Biden an even wider margin than the opinion polls are, except for a brief period around the end of August when the markets appeared to close up and they thought perhaps the Republicans might have gotten a lift from their nominating convention, which didn't turn out to be the case. Historically, the betting markets have sometimes been a better guide to the outcome of a presidential election than the opinion polls have been, but both of them got it wrong in 2016. And that's something that we have to bear in mind before we draw the obvious conclusion from what the opinion polls and the betting markets are saying. I think there are 5 reasons why the opinion polls and the betting markets won't be wrong this time as they were 4 years ago. The first is that 4 years ago, Donald Trump was running as an insurgent or an outsider, whereas this time he's running as an incumbent president with a record to defend. And as I'll show you in a moment, over the course of his first term, his approval ratings have been lower than those of any other first-term president since the end of World War II. The second thing is that although Hillary Clinton maintained a lead over Trump in the opinion polls throughout most of the 2016 campaign, it was never as wide as Biden's has been since he became the Democratic nominee, and Hillary Clinton rarely exceeded 50% in the polls as Biden has consistently done. Moreover, although in the end Clinton still had a lead in the opinion polls as voters were going to vote in November 2016, her lead had visibly shrunk over the last 2 weeks of the campaign, which hasn't happened to Biden's in this instance. The third key difference, which I'll show you in a moment, is that the independent and third party vote was unusually high in 2016, especially in some of the states that turned out to be critical. And that made it easier for Trump to win those states, and hence the Electoral College vote, despite losing the popular vote nationwide. Whereas by contrast, it looks as though the third party and independent vote in this election is going to be quite small, much like it was in the elections of 72, 76, 84, 88, and 2004, 2008, and 2012, all of which were won by the candidate who won more than 50% of the popular vote nationwide. Fourth, an unusually large proportion of voters remained undecided until the last minute in the 2016 campaign, and most of those ended up voting for Donald Trump, possibly after the then FBI Director Jim Comey announced on the 28th of October, that is very late in the campaign, that he was reopening the investigation of Hillary Clinton's emails that had been supposedly closed earlier in the campaign. This time around, the undecided vote is much smaller. voters appear to have made up their minds already to a much greater extent than they had 4 years ago. And the fifth difference, I think, is that an unusually large number of voters have cast their ballots already, either in person, which you can do in the US, or by sending in a postal vote. And it would appear that that's a trend favouring the Democrats, who, for example, are more fearful of catching COVID-19 by standing around for a long time in polling places than Republicans, who appear more often than not to have swallowed Trump's assertions that COVID doesn't represent much of a threat. And Democrats, of course, are more apprehensive about measures that the Republicans have threatened to take to suppress the vote, especially among African American and other minority voters during the campaign, rather than Republicans being concerned on that score. Some pundits suggest that the high number of early votes presages a very high overall turnout in this election. Remember that voting in the United States isn't compulsory as it is in Australia, and quite often the turnout has been less than 50% at elections in the past few decades. But some pundits are predicting that the turnout at this election could exceed 65%, which would be the highest in any election since 1908. And since traditionally it's younger voters and minority voters among whom turnout rates are lower, a high turnout is something that would probably favour the Democrats rather than the Republicans. So just to illustrate some of those points briefly before we move on, this chart shows, as I mentioned before, the first of the key differences between 2016 and today is that Trump is running as an incumbent, not as an outsider. And voter assessments of his performance throughout the first 4 years of his time in office have been lower than those of any first-term president seeking re-election since the end of the Second World War. Second, if I can just get that to come back, Hillary Clinton rarely exceeded 50% in the opinion polls during the 2016 election campaign, and more generally, her lead over Donald Trump was much narrower and more volatile than Biden's has been during the 2020 election. And as you can see, although Biden's lead over Trump has narrowed a bit in the last 2 weeks, it's from a higher starting point, above 52%, and it's been smaller than the decline in Hillary Clinton's lead was in the last few weeks of the 2016 election campaign. Third, you can see from this chart that the independent and third party vote in the 2016 election was the highest it had been in any election since those of 1992 and 1996, when Ross Perot ran as an independent or third party candidate. If the US had had preferential voting in the same way that we do in Australia, George H.W. Bush almost certainly would have won the 1992 election on what would have been Ross Perot's preferences, and Bill Clinton probably wouldn't have been the candidate in 1996. George W. Bush was able to win the 2000 election in part because Ralph Nader, who ran as a third-party candidate for the Greens in 2000, siphoned off a lot of votes that otherwise would have gone to the Democrat candidate Al Gore, particularly in the state of Florida, which turned out to be crucial to the Supreme Court's decision on the outcome of the 2000 election. Whereas all the opinion polls suggest that in this election, the independent vote is going to be pretty low, probably as low as it was in the elections of 72 and 76, 84 and 88, which Ronald Reagan won, 2004, which George Bush won much more easily than he did in 2000, or 2008 and 2012, which Barack Obama won. And you can see, if you look closely at the numbers, that in each of those elections, the candidate who won the presidency won with more than 50% of the popular vote. So the fact that the independent vote is likely to be small is probably going to work in Joe Biden's favour this time. The fourth point I mentioned is that an unusually high proportion of voters have voted early in this year's election compared with the same stage of 2016. And for the reasons I mentioned before, that's probably going to favour the Democrats, especially because it would seem that in many of the states that voted for Trump in 2016, that you would normally have expected to have voted for the Democrat candidate, the proportion of people who voted early is significantly higher than it was in 2016. And then finally, as I mentioned, fewer voters appear to be undecided this time than in 2016, when the proportion of people who left it to the last minute to make up their minds as to whom they would vote for was unusually high. And it seems as though most of those who were undecided a week out from the 2016 election ended up voting for Donald Trump. I guess Donald Trump's performance in office means that people know whether they love him or they hate him, and there's far less uncertainty about what a Trump presidency might mean if he gets a second term, now that we know what he's been like in his first term. Of course, there's still the possibility that the result could be very close, even if it would appear on the night that Joe Biden is likely to be the winner. And in those circumstances, there are a number of things that could potentially happen. Ordinarily, as I've mentioned, the outcome of the election is officially determined by the Electoral College, which meets in practice in the capitals of the respective states on the first Monday after the second Wednesday in December, which this year is the 14th of December, and there they cast their ballots for president. Each state, as I explained before, in the District of Columbia, typically awards all of their Electoral College votes, which is equal to the number of senators and members of the House, to the candidate who wins the largest number of votes in their state. The only two exceptions to that are Nebraska and Maine, who award their delegates to the winners of the popular vote in each of their congressional districts, plus the two votes representing the number of senators they have to the winner of the popular vote in the state as a whole. So in those two states, as happened in Maine last time, one candidate could win one of those Electoral College votes and another candidate the other, and the winner of the overall vote in that state would get the remaining two congressional delegates. But overwhelmingly, as I say, it's winner take all in each state. Once the Electoral College has awarded its votes, on the 6th of January, the newly elected House and Senate meet jointly for a formal count of the Electoral College vote, and then the winner is officially sworn in at noon on the 20th of January, which is known as Inauguration Day, and the winner then gives his inaugural speech. However, as we saw in 2000, either party can initiate legal action to challenge the result of ballots in individual counties or polling places, or across entire states, as happened in Florida in the year 2000. And ultimately, legal cases could be taken all the way to the US Supreme Court, where, as a result of the nomination earlier this week, or the confirmation earlier this week, of the nomination of Amy Coney Barnett to the Supreme Court, conservative judges now have a 6-3 majority. In other words, if a challenge to the outcome in individual states gets to the Supreme Court, it's highly likely to be decided in favor of the Republicans. It's perhaps also worth noting that although it's been the practice since the late 19th century for states to award their Electoral College delegates' votes to the candidate who wins the popular vote in each state, there's nothing in the Constitution that says that's what they have to do. In fact, Article 2 of the American Constitution says that each state can appoint electors in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct. And there are some Republicans who've said that in the event of a disputed vote, state legislatures should in fact determine for themselves who the Electoral College delegates from that state would vote for. And in 6 of the most closely contested states, Arizona, Florida, Michigan, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, the Republican Party controlled both houses of the state legislature. And in 2 of those, Arizona and Florida, there's also a Republican governor. So it's a possibility in certain circumstances that the outcome in particular states could be determined not by reference to the popular vote, but by Republicans having the legal and constitutional authority to award that state's delegates to Donald Trump, irrespective of how the people of that state would vote it. It's also possible in the event, for example, that a Republican-controlled legislature approves one delegation, but in those states where the governor is a Democrat, he signs off on another, that you have competing delegations purporting to represent a state in the Electoral College. That hasn't happened since 1876, when 4 states were in that position. But in those circumstances, the Constitution provides that the decision as to which delegation is recognised by Congress rests with the President of the Senate, who under the Constitution is the Vice President of the United States, that is to say, Mike Pence, and it's pretty clear how he would cast his vote in those circumstances should it come to that. Of course, if the result's clear, next Tuesday evening American time, Wednesday our time, then none of the above possibilities is likely to eventuate. And so I guess, given all the other risks, including the potential for violence in the streets if the election is close, or if it's decided by judges rather than by the outcome of voting, then let's hope that whatever the result is, the outcome is clear and we don't have to resort to these kind of means. Of course, it's not just the presidency which is up for election next Tuesday. Crucially also is the Senate, the more powerful of the 2 houses of the United States Congress. I'm not going to talk about the outcome for the House of Representatives because it seems pretty clear that the Democrats are going to retain control of that and possibly increase their majority over what they achieved at the midterm elections in 2018. But the position in the Senate, which has been controlled by the Republicans since 2014, is far less clear. Each state has, as I mentioned before, 2 senators, and under the Constitution, they serve 6-year terms. So that typically in each election year, 33 or 34 Senate seats are up for grabs. And it's only when one or more states have a special election, which they do if there's been a casual vacancy since the last election, which has been filled by the governor of that state, as occurred, for example, in Georgia this year, that you will get more than those, and where you might, as you're having in Georgia this year, both Senate positions being up for grabs. But normally it's about a third of the Senate that is up for election each election year. Because the Republicans won so many seats 6 years ago in 2014, when with a swing of 9 seats, the largest by either party since 1980, they regained control of the Senate, which they'd previously lost in 2006. The Republicans are defending 24 vacancies, whereas the Democrats are only defending 10. The opinion polls suggest that the Democrats will lose the seat they picked up in Alabama at a special election in 2017 held to replace Jeff Sessions, whom you might remember Donald Trump had appointed as his first Attorney General, and the Republicans then nominated a rather unelectable candidate who, for the first time in a long time, failed to hold the seat for the Republicans. And the Democrats will probably lose that. It will probably revert to a Republican. But the Democrats will hold their other 9 contested seats, and the opinion polls suggest that they're almost certain to flip Colorado, Iowa, Arizona, and probably Maine and North Carolina, notwithstanding that the Democrat candidate in North Carolina has been involved in a sexting scandal, which in the past has sometimes been fatal to a candidate's prospects of winning, but not, it would appear, according to opinion polls on this occasion. If that's right, if the Democrats win 5 seats off the Republicans but lose Alabama, that would give them control of the Senate by 51 to 49, with Kamala Harris as casting vote as president of the Senate, which is one of the responsibilities of the vice president, if it's needed. And that would be sufficient for a Biden administration to keep control, to pass its critical legislation, provided, of course, that all the Democrats actually vote the party line. I should mention in passing in that context that the Senate Democrats are less progressive, in inverted commas, less liberal in the American sense of the term, less left-wing, if you like, than the Democrats in the House of Representatives. Although left-leaning senators like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren attract a great deal of public attention, they're the exception rather than the rule in the Senate. And the candidates who are likely to win seats from the Republicans in the Senate races I've mentioned are almost by definition more moderate, less liberal than the existing Democratic senators. Indeed, if they weren't, they probably wouldn't stand much chance of election, especially in traditionally conservative states like Arizona and to some degree Maine. Let's turn to what an elected President Joe Biden might and might not do. One of the factors that's attracted a lot of attention in the past few weeks, especially following the nomination and confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett as a Supreme Court Justice, giving the Conservatives, as I mentioned before, a 6-3 majority on the Supreme Court, has been the suggestion that Joe Biden, if elected, and with a Democratic majority in the Senate, might move swiftly to appoint 4 new Supreme Court justices so as to restore a liberal majority and prevent a conservative-dominated court from thwarting the new administration's policies or from overturning Obamacare. That's the signature achievement of the Obama administration, or even more controversially, the long-standing Roe v. Wade case that made abortion legal, subject to restrictions, across the United States. The Democrats' determination to do this has, of course, been fueled by the fact that the Republicans broke with a long-standing convention that Supreme Court justices wouldn't be appointed so close to an election, and directly contradicted the position Republicans took in 2016 when they refused even to hold hearings on Obama's nomination of Merrick Garland as a Supreme Court justice, arguing that such an important decision shouldn't be made until after the presidential outcome was known. Well, that wasn't a principle that informed their decision in 2020. There's nothing in the Constitution that says how many Supreme Court justices there should be. There have been 9 since 1869, but President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1936 did seek to increase the number of Supreme Court justices after the Supreme Court had overruled a lot of his New Deal legislation during his first term between 1933 and 1936. There was, despite Roosevelt's victory in the 1936 election, a fairly savage backlash to Roosevelt's proposal, and he subsequently backed off. And that may be something that Biden has in mind when he sought to distance himself from the suggestion that he would enlarge the Supreme Court, as many Democrats would like him to do. He may also be wary, of course, of setting a precedent for a future Republican administration to do the same thing, that is, to enlarge the court even further if they thought it would be in their partisan interest. Something that's perhaps more likely is that the Democrats will seek to create new states, certainly out of the District of Columbia, which their platform commits them to doing, and maybe also out of the territory of Puerto Rico in the Caribbean, which currently has the status of a territory. That's not difficult to do constitutionally. It only requires a majority in each House of Congress, which, as the opinion polls suggest, the Democrats are likely to have, and the signature of the president. And it's also something that would be much harder for a future Republican majority to do with the opposite intention, since most of the other remaining US territories, such as Guam or West American Samoa, are much smaller than the District of Columbia or Puerto Rico, and in any case, they also lean to the Democrats, as the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico do. Making states out of those two would give the Democrats another 4 senators, almost guaranteed, as well as a further increase in their representation in the House of Representatives. It's possible that either the Democrats or a future Republican majority could create new states by splitting existing ones, but that would require the consent of the states proposed to be split, and that's not necessarily guaranteed. So it's more likely that we'll see the creation of a 51st and 52nd state if the Democrats win the White House and the Senate than we will an attempt to enlarge the Supreme Court. Let's turn now to look at some of the policy challenges that an incoming President Biden might face. One of the more obvious ones, one of the ones that has traditionally been a focus of attention upon changes of administration in the US in the past, has been the size of the US budget deficit. The budget deficit widened during President Trump's first term from just under $600 billion or 3.25% of GDP in 2016 when President Obama left office, to 1 trillion or 5.5% of GDP in 2019, that is before the onset of the pandemic. And as you can see from the chart since then, the budget deficit has widened to over 3 trillion in the fiscal year ended the 30th of September, which is equivalent to almost 17% of GDP. That's close to double the deficit as a proportion of GDP at its height during the global financial crisis of 2008-9, and in fact is the highest budget deficit as a proportion of the US economy since the end of the Second World War in 1945. Likewise, the level of US government debt has ballooned to over 150% of GDP over the last 12 months. And the non-partisan Congressional Budget Office, the model for our own parliamentary budget office, has forecast that the US budget deficit would remain above $1 trillion per annum, at least until the end of this decade, with federal debt reaching over 38 trillion by the end of the decade. Now, enormous as those sums are, in current circumstances, reducing the budget deficit is not going to be a priority for the Biden administration in the same way that it was, for example, for Bill Clinton's administration when it was elected in 1992, and when Clinton's famous advisor, James Carville, notoriously said that if he were to be reincarnated, he'd want to come back as the bond market because it seemed to be able to exercise such a powerful influence over the policy choices that the Clinton administration found itself required to make. As bastions of fiscal conservatism like the IMF are now urging, in the face of the worst recession in the last 80 years, government should be running bigger budget deficits, and they should put off raising taxes or cutting government spending in order to reduce deficits until the economy has recovered. The Biden camp has certainly committed itself to increasing corporate and personal tax, largely by reversing the tax cuts that the Trump administration and the Republican majority pushed through at the beginning of 2017. Clearly, in respect of economic policy and in other areas, a Biden administration is going to be to the left of the Trump administration. It could hardly be otherwise, given that in most respects, the Trump administration has been the most right-wing since perhaps the Coolidge and Hoover administrations of the 1920s. But that doesn't mean to say it's going to be conspicuously more liberal or left-wing than the Obama administration. In particular, I'd emphasize that since he became the Democratic presumptive nominee, and especially since he was confirmed at the Democratic convention in August, Joe Biden's gone to considerable lengths to emphasize the differences between himself and the progressive wing of the Democratic Party led by Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. He's reminded both President Trump and voters more generally that he won the Democratic Party campaign, not those who've advocated universal health care for all, or the forgiveness of student debt, or a jobs guarantee and a Green New Deal. He hasn't signed up to any of those policies. He's not going to appoint Elizabeth Warren as Treasury Secretary, even if only so as to avoid creating a Senate vacancy in Massachusetts, which if he did, would then be filled by a Republican governor, thus potentially depriving a Biden administration of a friendly majority in the Senate. Yes, the Biden administration, if that's what we have, would reverse the Trump administration's cuts to corporate taxation and to personal income taxation. And it would also impose what the Americans call social security tax, what we in Australia would more likely call a payroll tax on high incomes, to increase the funding of social security, that's the age pension, and Medicare, that's healthcare for senior citizens. What that means is that the corporate tax rate would revert to 28%, where it was before 2017, from 21%. Biden has also said he'd impose an alternative minimum tax of 15% on corporations with book profits of $100 million or higher. What that means is that corporations would pay a minimum of 15% on their accounting profits, even if they had tax deductions that, if allowable, would take their tax rate below the statutory 28% figure, in much the same way that there's an alternative minimum tax in the personal income tax system in the United States that limits the extent to which high income earners can use deductions to reduce their personal income tax bill. A Biden administration would also raise the top rate of personal income tax that's payable on incomes exceeding 400,000 US dollars back to 39.6%, where it was before 2017, from the current level of 37%. He'd apply that rate rather than the current preferential rate of 28% to capital gains and dividend income in excess of $1 million US dollars. And he'd also limit the deductions which people earning more than 400,000 could make from their taxable income to 28% of the value of those deductions rather than the full marginal rate. As I mentioned, he'd introduce a 12.4% social security tax, which is currently payable on all wage and salary and self-employment incomes at a flat rate of up to 137,700 US dollars of income. He'd apply that tax to incomes over $400,000 as well. That would leave a part between about $138,000 and $400,000, which was exempt from that tax, which isn't an anomaly, but is consistent with Biden's pledge not to increase income taxes on people earning less than 400,000 US dollars a year. The Democrats have also said that the top rate of estate tax or death duty, which was lowered to 40% in 2009, would revert to 45%. And the exemption from estate duty, which was raised to about $11.5 million in 2017, would revert to where it was in 2009 at $3.5 million. On the other side of the equation, the Democrats' platform says that a Biden administration would reinstate the first home buyers tax credit of $15,000 US dollars that was initiated by the Obama administration and abolished by the Trump administration. And it would increase the child tax credit from $2,000 US dollars to $3,000, at least for the coming financial year, and keep it there for as long, in inverted commas, as economic conditions require. Another important economic policy is that the Biden administration says it would raise the federal minimum wage, which is currently $7.25 US an hour, to $15 an hour by 2026. Now that sounds like a lot, but it's worth bearing in mind that in a majority of states, the minimum wage is higher than the federal minimum. That includes the District of Columbia, where it's $14, California and Washington, where it's $13, and Massachusetts, where it's $12.75. And some of those states are already set to raise their minimum wages to $15 by 2023, as in the case, for example, of Massachusetts and California, or by 2025, as is the case in Illinois. There's been quite a lot of economic investigation by economists of increases in the minimum wage, and the general consensus appears to be that they haven't resulted in net losses of jobs overall. They may have done in some particular industries, but overall increases in the minimum wage where they've occurred in the last 20 years haven't had a negative impact on employment growth. Looking at the impact of Biden's tax proposals in a little bit more detail, the nonpartisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget says that the proposed increases in taxes amount to a little over $4 trillion over the next decade, or about 1.75% of GDP, partly offset by increases in the refundable tax credits I mentioned before. That would certainly be a large increase in taxes by historical standards, not as big as the increases in taxes legislated during World War II, but larger than any other administration has implemented in a single hit during the post-war period. Of the $4.3 trillion, $2.3 trillion comes from proposed increases in taxes on individuals, income tax, payroll tax, increased taxes on capital gains and dividends, and reductions in the value of tax deductions that high income earners are able to claim. It's worth noting that these only apply to households with incomes in excess of 400,000 US dollars. That, for context, is about 570,000 Australian dollars. And those households only account for about 1.5% of all American households. The remaining 1.8 trillion of additional tax revenues comes from increases in taxes on corporations. And since economists generally accept that increases in corporate taxes are to some extent borne by shareholders or workers, that indirectly will affect some workers and some shareholders. And taking that into account, the consensus of the 4 different estimates that are shown here, which include right-leaning think tanks such as the American Enterprise Institute is that the taxes paid by the bottom 80% of households would rise by between about 1.25% and 0.5%. The taxes paid by the top 20% would rise by between about 2.25% and 5.75%. And within that top 20%, the taxes paid by the top 1% of households, that's people earning over 837,000 US dollars or over $1 million Australian dollars per annum, they would rise quite significantly by between about 13 and 18%. Now, in terms of the impact of that on the economy, it's worth remembering that just as here in Australia, people seem to accept that tax cuts that are skewed towards middle and upper income earners, as the third tranche of the tax cuts proposed by the Morrison government due to come into effect in 2024 undoubtedly are, they tend to be saved or used to pay down debt rather than spent. In the same way, the tax increases that are proposed by the Democrats and which would probably be implemented if a Biden administration were to be elected, fall disproportionately on high income earners. And the same logic says that they're likely to be paid predominantly by running down savings rather than by cutting spending on the part of top income earners. So the impact of these proposed tax cuts on economic growth in the United States and on employment is probably not going to be that serious. In the same way that the increases in top taxes legislated by the Clinton administration in 1993 didn't have any discernible impact on economic growth in the United States. Indeed, during the Clinton administration's first term, when those tax increases were enacted, the unemployment rate fell from about 7% at the beginning to around 5% at the end, and continued to decline to 3.9% by the end of the Clinton administration's second term in the year 2000. Let's turn to trade, where one of the few things that Trump can say he's done as he has promised has been to increase tariffs with a view to disentangling the US economy from China. Last month, the Brookings Institution, based in Washington, published a very useful analysis of the impact of the Trump administration's trade policies. That analysis suggests, as most economists would have known, that the tariffs have been paid not by Chinese exporters to the United States in the form of checks being written to the US Treasury, but rather in effect by American consumers and businesses who use products that have been subject to tariffs like steel or timber in the form of higher prices for those goods and products. Economists know from their training that tariffs are not something, as is popularly supposed, that governments make foreigners pay in order to get their goods into the country. Rather, they're something that governments, perhaps inadvertently, make their own consumers and businesses pay in order to keep foreign goods out of the country. And while the Trump administration claims that hundreds of thousands of jobs have been created or saved by the tariffs that the Trump administration has been imposed, for example, in the steel industry or in the washing machine industry, according to the Brookings Institution, the number of jobs created in those industries has been fairly small, and in most cases more than offset by declines in employment in the industries that use those products that have been subject to tariffs and have thus had to pay more for them or faced foreign retaliation on their exports. And according to the Brookings study, the jobs that have been created at very high cost, upwards of $800,000 or $900,000 for every job that's been created as a result of them. And of course, those tariffs have made the US a less desirable trading partner for other countries and have potentially put at risk aspects of American national security, despite the use of national security legislation as an excuse to impose those tariffs. Now, I'm not going to suggest that a Biden administration would reverse those tariffs. One of the few things on which there's bipartisan agreement across the US political spectrum is the desirability of disengaging the US economy from China, of making it less dependent on China as a market, China as a source of imports, or China as a source of foreign capital and investment. And Biden isn't going to disagree with those objectives to any significant degree. He's probably not, at least in the near term, going to lower or reverse the tariffs which the Trump administration has imposed on the United States. And he probably would continue to use national security laws to restrict the import of certain products from China. The Democratic Party platform says that a Democratic administration would continue to single out the Chinese government for currency manipulation and misaligning their exchange rate to gain an unfair advantage, in inverted commas, over American producers. Now, Biden hasn't specifically committed to that. And the reality, of course, is that the Chinese currency has actually been appreciating against the US dollar this year rather than depreciating. But nonetheless, the threat to use legislation against the Chinese for alleged currency manipulation is obviously going to remain on the tables under a Biden administration, if that's what we get. Also important from an Australian perspective is the commitment in the Democratic Party platform to impose a carbon adjustment fee at the border, or in other words, a tariff, on products from countries that fail to live up to their commitments under the Paris Climate Agreement, which could, under the Morrison government's policies, include Australia. And that would increase the likelihood of similar measures being implemented by the EU, which has long advocated them, and now, given the commitment by the new Japanese Prime Minister Suga to zero emissions by 2050, could also include Japan, which is Australia's second most important trading partner. A Biden administration might strengthen the Buy American rules pertaining to government procurement, especially with regard to products like steel and cement. That would be a problem for trading partners like Canada and Mexico, or Japan and Korea, but wouldn't have many implications for Australia since we don't export that stuff in any significant quantities to the United States. More positively, a Biden administration would seek to re-engage with the trade partnership of the Pacific that Hillary Clinton was ambivalent about and which Donald Trump spurned in one of his first actions upon coming to office in early 2017. The Biden administration, if that's what we have, would, I think, see re-engaging with the TPP as a gesture towards restoring relations with Asian allies that have been damaged by the Trump administration. Although almost certainly it would require some renegotiation of the labour and environmental standards in the TPP as a condition for full US participation. Importantly, a Biden administration would likely be more supportive of the World Trade Organization and would end the Trump administration's embargo on the appointments of personnel to dispute resolution tribunals, which has in effect kneecapped the WTO's capacity to arbitrate trade disputes in the last 3 or 4 years. One problem the US may still have to confront under a Biden administration is downward pressure on the US dollar arising from the US's persistent current account deficits. Normally, the US current account deficit narrows during recessions because of the decline in imports and especially demand for investment goods, which are often imported, that happens in recessions. But unusually, during the current recession, the current account deficit has actually widened rather than shrunk. And that's probably because although saving has declined to some extent because of the widening in the budget deficit, though that's been partly offset by the significant, though I suspect temporary, increase in household saving, investment hasn't declined by very much. And that in turn is probably because investment didn't rise very much during the 10 years after the global financial crisis, certainly not as much as it did during previous economic recoveries, and importantly, notwithstanding the corporate tax cuts that the Trump administration instituted at the beginning of 2017. The instant asset write-off or expensing of investment that was part of the Trump administration's tax package did do something to boost investment, but the cut in the corporate tax rate, according to all of the evidence, did very little. It certainly boosted share prices, it boosted share buybacks and executive remuneration, but it didn't do anything to increase the level of corporate investment. And that's one reason why I think reinstating the 28% corporate tax rate, as Biden has pledged to do, wouldn't have a particularly adverse impact on the level of business investment. Finally, let me talk about foreign policy. I don't claim to be an expert in that area, but there are obviously aspects of foreign policy that have important economic policy dimensions. The Democratic Party's platform says that as a Pacific power, the United States should work closely with its allies and partners to advance America's shared prosperity, security, and values. That's something that the Trump administration has conspicuously failed to do. It's cuddled up to dictators like Vladimir Putin, Erdogan in Turkey, Orban in Hungary, Kaczynski in Poland, and at least until the onset of the pandemic was pretty cuddly with Xi Jinping in China as well. Whereas by contrast, the administration has almost glorified in being rude to long-standing US allies, including Japan and South Korea, Canada, and in particular Europe, the United Kingdom, France, and Germany. The Democratic platform says rather than denigrate America's trading partners and encouraging tensions between our allies, the United States will work to strengthen ties with key allies, especially in the Asia-Pacific region, such as Japan, South Korea, and Australia, with whom the United States has treaties, and with countries that have usually aligned themselves with the United States, such as Thailand and the Philippines. And it would appear that the Democratic platform implicitly recognises Indonesia's long-standing non-aligned status and reluctance formally to align itself with any of the world's big powers. But it does seem clear that a Biden administration would seek to improve the relationships between what are, after all, the world's second and third largest democracies. Importantly, from the point of view of smaller countries like Australia and the nations of Southeast Asia, a Biden administration would re-engage with important multilateral institutions, not just the WTO, which I've also mentioned, but the World Health Organization and the United Nations. The United States would again seek to play a leadership role in those organizations, rather than, as the Trump administration has effectively allowed to happen, the Chinese insinuating some of their most talented personnel into leadership positions in those institutions, bending the way they operate to accommodate the growing aspirations and objectives of the Chinese Communist Party. A Biden administration would immediately rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement, from which the Trump administration withdrew the United States. It would include specific commitments to robust engagement with regional institutions like ASEAN, in order to, as the platform says, help promote the rule of law, sustainable, inclusive economic growth on both sides of the Pacific. One very important challenge that I think the Biden administration may face early in its term, if it's elected, is the possibility that China will seek to test its resolve to defend Taiwan in the event of Chinese military aggression, in much the same way that the Soviet Union's Nikita Khrushchev sought to test John F. Kennedy's resolve by installing nuclear missiles in Cuba in 1962, something which, as we now know, though we didn't realize at the time, brought the world perilously close to nuclear war between the world's two superpowers that had nuclear weapons. Xi Jinping is unlikely to launch a full-scale military invasion of Taiwan, although the People's Liberation Army has been conducting exercises with that objective seemingly in mind on the Chinese mainland in recent months. And at last year's Party Congress, they did conspicuously remove the word peaceful from the Communist Party's long-standing aspiration for the reunification of Taiwan with the Chinese mainland. But I wouldn't be at all surprised if the Chinese embarked upon something less aggressive or dangerous than a full-scale invasion, such as assaulting the Taiwanese-controlled islands of Quemoy and Matsu that are quite close to the Fujian coast, as Mao Zedong did in 1958. He could authorize military aircraft overflying the Taiwanese airspace, or possibly ordering People's Liberation Army Navy vessels to venture close to or even into Taiwanese territorial waters, and thus be willing to see whether the Biden administration would respond, as the Clinton administration did, to a similar provocation in the mid-1990s, to which the Clinton administration responded by sending aircraft carriers and other naval vessels through the Straits of Taiwan, something which would be harder to do now that China has its own aircraft carriers, which it didn't do then. If the Biden administration conveys the impression by its response that the US's diminishing willingness to project military force into the Western Pacific, something which started under the Obama administration but was significantly accelerated under Trump, or cast doubt on its willingness to stand by its previous commitments to Taiwan, is something that's going to be noted very carefully by other countries in the region who, if Biden fails that test, may be forced to rethink how they view relationships with China and the United States, and whether they in turn can regard the United States as a reliable ally in the event of a very serious external threat. On that note, let me wind up, and again, thank you for being here for this webinar. Before I leave, can I mention that we will be conducting another webinar on the 25th of November. That's a Wednesday. Haven't yet decided what the topic will be. Could depend on the outcome of the election, but whatever it is, I'm sure over the next 4 weeks, there are going to be things that will be worth talking about in this format. So please keep an eye on this site for details of what the topic will be and when it will be held. Just before we conclude, I'd like to hand over to my business partner, Rati Lahore, who will say a bit more about the website and about future activities here. Rati, over to you.
Thank you, Saul, for a great presentation. Thank you, everyone, for being here with us today. Some of you already know me, but for those who doesn't know me, I'm Rati Luhur. I have been managing Saul's website for many years. I'm very honored that Saul is now trusting me to develop his online community and to make his work more accessible to the world. Since we are only a small team of 2, you'll be seeing more of me as we continue to develop better ways of engaging with you. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any ideas, questions, or concerns. I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rati. And again, thank you to everyone who sat in on this webinar, whether you're in Australia or in Indonesia or elsewhere in Asia or in Europe. It's been a pleasure and an honor having you there, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.